So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So today I want to talk about just a review from the ground up how we how we edit our images traditionally. Okay. So as we edit our images inside Camera Raw or Lightroom or Photopea, same kind of concept. You're going to want to go ahead and make sure the first thing that you do, uh, remind me later. Okay, let's go back to that. Sorry about that. First thing that we want to do is we always want to evaluate the overall base exposure. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up to that basic panel here, and let's grab that exposure slider and let's adjust it primarily for the subjects. What would be the correct brightness for our subjects? And I'm thinking right about here looks pretty good. Now notice when I did that, that's a global adjustment, so it affected the entire image at large and it washed out the whitewash from the waves up here in the upper right hand corner. So come back to that basic palette. Don't forget that we have a highlights option. This was formerly called recovery, and now they've changed it to highlights because typically when we're doing this, we are recovering the highlights because they get washed out to the overall exposure adjustment. So I'm going to grab that slider. Notice if I drag that all the way to the left, it recovers that washed out information. Okay, so now we have the overall base exposure looks pretty good. Once we have mapped our base value and any intermediate values, meaning midtones or highlights, then we can move on to our color balance. And you go, well, why is that important? We're going to go to black and white. You know, it may or may not affect the image from a black and white stance. My main thought is always be a routine in how you approach editing all your images. Okay, and it's really good to be disciplined. That way you can kind of rule out any errors along the way. So looking at this, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and adjust that color balance. Now remember, right here we have a white balance option. I can choose as shot, which is how the camera saw the color white balance, or I can go ahead and apply one of these many automatic presets built into the application. And again, these are all balanced based off of the type of lighting that you've shot under. So for instance, I'm going to go with shade. And I really like what that does for the skin tones for both the infant as well as the toddler over here. I might decide just to warm that up a little bit more. All right, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here now. And let's take a look at the toddler on the left. She looks a little bit too dark. Infant on the right looks good. Mom looks good. But she's looking a little bit lost here. So let's remind ourselves how to do local adjustments inside Camera Raw. You're going to come over to your toolbar on the right-hand side, and you can see the tool that I'm going to use is the adjustment brush. Notice when I click on this entire panel right here updates. Now I have a brush panel allowing me to adjust the size as well as the amount of feathering. And then down here, after I've applied the overlay, you can see that I have the options that I had more or less in the basic palette for the entire image. So grabbing that, I'm going to scale my brush up just a little bit. I'm doing that using the bracket keys on my keyboard. I'm going to click and hold, and actually, before I do that, just put a little bit of an adjustment in there so we can actually see it happen as we paint over her. Always try and scale that brush down a little bit because when you're using a soft brush, you can kind of create a halo by accident. Notice I'm trying to stay within her body as much as possible here with this brush to really not go past here. Let's come down, let's get her leg right here. And because that's a feathered brush, I am going right up against the edge, but I don't want to go too far because, again, that could create a halo. And you'll see that again. Let me remind you of how that might look. All right, so if I crank this all the way to the right, that's a pretty decent mask job. I'm going to leave it all the way to the right just for a second. And you go, well, that looks horrible. Yeah, it does. But I'm going to do that just so I could go ahead and see where I need to kind of beef up this mask a little bit more in here. Make sure I get all of her. Notice I'm still trying to kind of stay within that hair to hopefully not create too much of a halo. Let's get the fingertips in there. So again, I'm just using the setting cranked way up so that I can see what I've missed. This image here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's take that exposure setting. Let's put it back down to 0. So for her, I think I can bring that exposure up slightly. I don't want to overemphasize it. I think I can boost her contrast maybe just a little bit. And additionally, I'm going to compare her to the baby. I think I might want to go ahead and warm up her color temperature just a skosh to go ahead and warm her skin tones up. I think that looks pretty good overall. All right, last thing I want to deal with on this image is this little guy up here in the top right-hand corner. I don't know if that's an errant surfer out there in the water. Looks like it could be a surfer waiting for a set to come in. Could be a leaf off this tree. We don't know because it's so out of focus. But we want to get rid of it. It's kind of distracting. So if we come over here, let's take a look and see where that brush is at now. It's going to be under here, spot removal tool. Let's click on that. Notice I get a very limited palette. Remember, I want to remind you, you have two options. You can either clone or heal. I always say leave it set to heal because remember what heal does is it clones texture from the given area and applies it to the damaged area, but it blends that new texture with the original color. So you want to always use heal as much as you can. Feathering, that's important as well. Notice that you can see the size of my feathering from my brush there. Don't forget that dotted circle that we see around represents the feathered soft edge, how far out it extends from the actual literal brush. The literal brush there is that round circle, solid circle that you see there. So I'm going to scale this just a little bit bigger than the area I'm trying to repair, and then I'm going to click on it, and notice it goes out and it does what we call kind of a proximity match, and it goes to find texture that's relatively close to the area I'm trying to repair. One of the things you always want to look at is make sure that it doesn't toss texture in there that's going to be noticeable because there's a pattern that duplicates. And I kind of see a little bit of one here. There's kind of a little bit of a round circle, and it's applying a round circle there. So I'm going to click and hold, and let's pull this over a little bit and see if I can find something that might make this look a little bit better. Trying to see if I can match up those kind of wake lines that we have right there. Let's go back. Maybe right in here. Okay, I'm going to go with that. All right, so now let's go ahead and zoom back out. Now that I'm happy with this overall, I could do one of two things. I could go ahead and address the black and white here right now, or I could do it in Photoshop. I say, why don't we take a look at it now and see how it's going to look here, because we have the same channel mixers available to us here inside Camera Raw that we would in Photoshop. But what's even better is we have the control over all the extended data here. So with that said, let's click on black and white, and you'll notice that it puts the image into black and white. It looks like it's desaturated, however, it hasn't. Okay, the colors are still there. What the application has done is it's matched the correct gray value for luminance with the colors that are there. That said, because the colors are still there, we can go ahead and control the hue of the underlying color to get different gray values associated for the final black and white. So for instance, I believe his shirt was green. So if I come over here and I grab the greens, well, it affects his shirt a little bit. Notice it affects more of the foliage in the background. And I think I might actually bring that up a little bit. That creates a lot more texture in the background. Let's take a look at purples, which would be her little hoodie for sure. So if I grab that purple slider, yeah, and it's also affecting the little baby as well here. So I could go ahead and change the way those look based off of changing that underlying color. So I'm going to crank that up to kind of make them stand out a little bit. There should probably more than likely be a lot of yellows over the entire image. You can kind of see it there. Might bring that down a little bit. Notice it adds more texture back to this scene. Additionally, red's going to be in this shot, primarily in the skin tones that you can see there. So if I want to, I could brighten those skin tones up. Now, it's always good when you're doing this to zoom in here, because if I do it too much, it can sometimes degrade the final image because you're shifting, one channel. Remember that the image is made up of multiple channels laid on top of one another, RGB. Let's go maybe right about there. And we should have some blues in this image as well. So we've got it there in the blue jeans. You notice I could take those blue jeans down quite a bit if I wanted to. And I don't think that looks good because it feels like it's emphasizing the grain there. So I'll leave that where that's at. And let's see about orange in this image. Yes, we do have orange in this image. You notice you don't want to go too far. Okay? Notice how that affects the skin tone of both the kids. So again, I think that'll work right about there. Okay, last thing I want to do is, don't forget, as with any digital image, because we're working with the raw data from the sensor, we want to go ahead and evaluate the overall detail for grain and noise. So if we go up to the Detail tab right here, you'll see that we have sharpening and noise reduction. We also have color noise reduction. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, and that's at 200%. Zoom in a little bit more, and let's go ahead and reduce the noise reduction, the grain here. So I'm going to bring that to the right slowly. Now I'm looking at the image as I do that. Let me take that back out, and I want you to stare just kind of in one area, maybe right here at the cheek. It's just kind of like a live process, and you don't want to overdo it, because if you overdo it, you can actually start to kind of blur out more of the detail. All right, so I think I'm pretty happy with this overall. Now, let me remind you, down here at the bottom right-hand side inside Camera Raw, we can cancel what we've done. We can click on Done, which will simply close out the image and record all the edits we've done in a container file now that is embedded with this image, okay? Or we can open the image, and notice we have some options. Open, open as object, open as a copy. I just leave it set to the standard. Go ahead and click Open. And what it's going to do now is it's going to go ahead and open up a copy of the image with the Camera Raw edits embedded in it permanently. So in essence, we're looking at a new image. So let me remind you, let me go ahead and reset my workspace here. Let's go Workspace, let's go Photography. That way that cleans that up a little bit. And I'm going to pull the Layers palette out here, because the Layers palette is one of the more important palettes we have. Don't forget quick keystrokes, Command plus or minus to zoom in. Now, looking at this, one of the first things I want to do is I want to go ahead and do my sharpening. Don't forget that whenever you bring an image into Photoshop, or Photopea for that matter, you're going to duplicate the layer and you're going to work on the top copy. That way you can very quickly turn this off and on to evaluate the level of sharpening, a quick before and after. Looks like my computer's thinking a little bit here. Hang tight. I'm going to see if I hop into, nope, it is not happy. Okay, so I'm going to select that newly copied layer. I'm going to go up to Filter. Let's come down to Sharpen. And then we're going to go to Unsharp Mask. Now, I'll remind you, this is the preferred method. Now, you may find something different for yourself as you move along and develop your photography skills, and that's totally great. That's what you want to do, because there's about 100 different ways to do one thing in Photoshop and vice versa in Camera Raw, Lightroom, all that stuff. My preferred method for sharpening has always been through Photoshop, especially because I'm doing it on an actual copy or layer, and I can really compare that. Now, remember, the starting point for you should be 80, and then 4, and then 4. So let's revisit really quickly what these actually do. So within the context of the filter, the sharpen, unsharp mask filter, we're basically running an algorithm on the image, and the filter is going to analyze the image for what it believes are edges, okay? Meaning like, here's an edge right here. Here's an edge of the rope against the background, the profile of her arm, the profile of the baby's head, so on and so forth. And the application will identify what it believes are edges in the image, and then based off the settings in this dialog box, it's going to increase or decrease the contrast along those edges. Typically, we're looking to increase the contrast along those edges. Now, the amount can be anywhere from 0 on up to 500%. I don't really see anything usable past 110%. I generally work between, anywhere between 60 and 110% seems to be the amount that works for me. And that's really based off of the actual clarity contained in the image, when you actually captured the image. And that's really based off the quality of your optics as well. So I usually start at about 80 for the amount. Now, don't forget the radius here defines how far out on either side of the edge it's going to increase the pixels. So if the radius is 4, that means it's going to increase the pixels 2 pixels on the left and 2 pixels on the right-hand side of the edge to give it more kind of a pop. The threshold tells the algorithm there has to be this many differences from one pixel to the next before you can sharpen it. So the higher this number for the threshold, the less sharpening you typically see. So let's zoom in on this image a little bit. You can see that it's already been sharpened now just by the nature of the previous settings. Let's turn the preview off and on, and you can see actually what that is actually doing. And it seems to really kind of make the edges a little bit too much. So first thing I would do is I would start and take that amount down. Click that preview off and on. That seems to help a little bit, but let's take that radius down to say 3. Okay, so that sharpening is getting a little bit better. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to avoid the kind of like halo-like edges that can sometimes occur, especially when you have images that contrast against the background. Let's take that threshold. I'm going to turn that threshold up to about 5. There we go. And I think that looks pretty good overall. I want you to pay attention to the rope down here in the right-hand corner, the baby's face, hairline, as well as the fence rails back here. As I turn this off and on, you can see that there's sharpening. You can typically see, or really see down here in the lower right-hand corner, how it's really affecting that rope quite a bit. The rails in the back, as well as the baby and everything else. So this looks like a pretty good level of sharpening. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to zoom back out. If I like this overall image, the next step for me would be to go ahead and turn this into an actual negative. Now, to do this, let's go ahead and flatten this image. Okay, that means I'm going to combine these layers into one layer. So I'm going to go up to the spring out menu here, or I could go to the layer menu here if you prefer, and let's pull down to flatten image. Now that image is completely flat. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let's unlock this. I just did that by double clicking on the layer. I'm going to hit OK. Notice it unlocks it. Now I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and I'm going to invert the image. So now we have a larger understanding of how this might actually look. So in its negative form, okay, we have a negative that's relatively transparent. And again, that's all based off of the actual values that are contained in the image. So when I go Image Adjustments and I go Invert, it's turning this essentially into a negative. So these areas are lighter on the negative, allowing more exposure to darken these areas. Notice the brighter items in the negative are her little hoodie, what the baby's wearing, and the light in the background. Okay, most everything seems to have more or less decent detail. But here's the catch for this. We want to be detail rich for this assignment. So for this, there's a couple things we're going to do now in this negative form. I'm going to, with the layer selected, go up to Image Adjustments, and I'm going to choose Shadow Highlights. Now, to date, they have not put this in the layers palette as an adjustment layer. I'm hoping that they do, but if I click on that, you'll notice that this dialog pops up right here. Now, typically we're using this with a positive form of the image. In this case, we're doing it as a negative. Let's click on that, show more options, and let's come over to shadows. So it's going to recognize shadows and highlights exactly the opposite. So for instance, if I look at shadows here, notice that when I increase this, it lightens that back there, as well as notice it's lightening the baby's sleepy and the infant's hoodie here. That's kind of what we want to do, because if I leave this set really dark here, this stuff is going to expose way quicker than this here. So we're kind of customizing the values in this negative so we can get one even exposure to get nice detail across the range. So for this, I'm going to come in, I'm going to crank those shadows up to open that up. Now, highlights are going to be reversed. It's going to recognize the shadows as the highlights here. So if I crank this over, you can see what that's going to do. Now, clearly, that is too much. You want to have a light hand. Again, working with that old adage that you always hear me say, less is more. So I'm just doing this to bring in a little bit more detail. I'm thinking right about, and there looks pretty good. I can preview that off and on. So there it is without my adjustments. Okay, so when this prints, this would look really good, but this top right-hand corner would be completely washed out. And then here it is with my adjustments. So now notice the brighter area, still the whitewash up here, that's probably going to print to paper white, but everything else going to get a really nice exposure, and there's a lot of luxurious detail here. So again, you're going to want to invert the image, and then you're going to want to evaluate it, because now we're looking at it in a negative form. Remember, our goal here is to go ahead and create a large negative that we can contact print on that cyanotyping paper. If I'm happy with this, I can go ahead and hit OK. Now, here's another thing I want to talk about. Let's take a quick look at resizing. Okay, now you are going to be limited to the size of 8.5 by 11, or letter size. Obviously, this image does not pan out to 8.5 by 11. So one of the things that you'll need to do is you're going to need to go ahead and set up a document for 8.5 by 11. So for instance, if I go to File, New, okay, it's going to go ahead and bring up this material here. I'm going to change it from pixels to inches here. And I want to take a look at the width. The width is going to be, going to allow me to change the width. There we go. 8.5 by 11. Let's make the height 8. Resolution of 240 is actually pretty good. We'll see. And I'm going to go ahead and create. All right. So now I'm going to come back to this image. And using a selection stroke, I'm going to go Command A to select everything. Okay. And then I'm going to go Command C to copy this image to the clipboard. I'm going to go back to my new document. And I'm actually going to hold Command and Shift, and I'm going to hit V. That'll paste it right in the center. So here you can see that the image is actually, based off of resolution, a little bit smaller. Remember, this is based off of 240. So there's a couple things we could do here. We could go ahead and scale this image up, which would be fine. If I wanted to do that, I could just simply, with the layer selected, I could go Command T. Notice that bounding box we're used to surrounds it. Click and hold on a handle, and then I could go ahead and scale up. When I'm happy with the size that I've scaled up, either hit Return/Enter or the check mark at the top of the page. Now, additionally, okay, so I've got enough for 3 sheets, I believe, for everybody to do this assignment. So what I was going to recommend, though, you're not limited solely to filling this out. Let's say I wanted to do more subjects or more photographs, okay, but I'm limited to 3 sheets. Well, I could go ahead and do this image, right? Maybe I want to go ahead and keep that at the size it is, or make it a little bit bigger. And notice I'm just doing this by hand, just by sight, giving myself a little bit of a gutter around the image right there. So now I could place another image here. So this is probably approximately 5 by 7 size, which is totally acceptable. So that'll give you the ability to do multiples of the same image with different negative qualities, or the ability to do multiple shots. Okay, remember, this is part 1 of this assignment. We'll actually be doing these with the negatives. Part 2 of this assignment will entail you actually using solid objects to do a photogram, and we'll take a look at Man Ray's work in class on Wednesday. Once you've got this done, and let's say I'm ready to go ahead and submit this, I would go ahead first. Let's put a little bit more on here. Let's go ahead and duplicate that. So your negative might look like this. Be sure to go ahead and flatten the image before you submit it. And when you submit this, I'm going to ask you to make sure that you submit it for me as a PSD. That's going to be really important, okay, because I want to have the best quality image possible so that when we print this using the transparency negative paper at school, that we're able to get the best possible negative overall, okay? So make sure that you leave it in a Photoshop format. And we'll test this out. You'll have to let me know if it says, hey, the attachment's too big, stuff like that. Then we'll have to figure out another way to get these submitted. So what I'm going to go ahead and do today is I'll go ahead and post this review video, and I'll create a new assignment for you to submit your negatives, okay? And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and get those submitted to me in a Photoshop document form. That way I can print directly from the Photoshop documents. Really quickly, before I stop the recording, does anybody have any questions about this process that I just went through that they would like answered? Okay. Let me go ahead and stop my recording here.